Look, let me begin with just a question. How many of you have heard of BTS? Okay, a few. I see a few hands. All right, I can give you a hint. It's not a technical term. It's not a television news thing. I will confess, I didn't know what BTS was until my 11-year-old daughter insisted that I know who this Korean supergroup boy band was that actually has a very large impact worldwide. And look, I'm a journalist, so when I learn something new, I want to do a deeper dive, learn more. So it wasn't a big lift when she insisted that when this Korean group became the first Korean musical act to play a U.S. stadium, Citi Field in New York, that we be there. So we went, and you know what? It was awesome. They were really great. These 7 young men singing about themes like inclusiveness, wholesomeness, loving yourself to really infectious beats, great dance moves, great harmonies. It was so good. I'm a writer, so I wrote about it. In this case, wrote about it just on my phone, made a little post. Within minutes, I couldn't believe the result. Hundreds of likes and shares right then from within the stadium and from around the world. Now, I enjoyed this concert so much, I'd intended to write a review. I'm a writer, so I did write the review, and the results of that really blew me away, and in fact, blew away a lot of ratings. What you're looking at here, this is the top of an interactivity chart for the #1 media market in the country, New York, on the weekend when BTS played Citi Field. #1, my station, PIX11 News, and the reason why is on the right side of your screen. These are the top posts from that weekend. 2 of the 4 were from me about BTS. I couldn't believe it. Now, what is it about BTS that has to do with relevance of media? As it turns out, quite a lot. Some of it not good, but overall, it speaks volumes about the need for interactivity and people communicating online, on television, on any variety of platforms. I'll also point out that when this happened, it was the same weekend that Brett Kavanaugh got confirmed as a Supreme Court justice. We'll talk more about that in a moment when we talk more about relevance of media, but that's well worth considering. The topic I was asked to speak about when I was asked to speak was how to make local news more relevant. Well, I am a news person, and so I have news for you. Local television news actually is relevant. The Pew Research Center, in its surveys, shows very clearly that the #1 source of news for Americans is television. And the majority of that interest in news from television comes from local television stations. But as you also see, online media sources are rapidly catching up. That's not necessarily because people don't want to get news from television. A big part of that is a lot of television news is online, right? We stream our broadcasts. We post all of our stories. We share them on a variety of platforms to have greater access. Very important part of this democracy. And that's something I hope I kept in mind on one story I did that's worth sharing. Pedro Hernandez was 16 years old when he was arrested in the Bronx for a variety of gun charges related to an attempted murder. He didn't do it, but he was arrested. He was given $250,000 bail, far more than his family could afford. And unlike a lot of young men of color and not of great means, rather than taking a plea deal, pleading guilty to a lesser crime so he could just get out of jail, he's like, no, I'm going to stay in jail until I can prove my innocence in court, even though I'm in the Bronx, where court cases can take years and people can just sit on remand in Rikers Island. He decided to still do that. a trusted source of mine, a private detective with whom I work a lot, told me about his story. And so I started telling a number of stories, writing them, broadcasting them about Pedro Hernandez, and Facebooking them, Instagramming them, tweeting them, getting some response. But it wasn't until I got a response from one person, Sean King, to my post. Perhaps you're familiar with him, an activist journalist who specializes in human rights issues and has a very large following. He saw this as an opportunity to engage his followers and said, what we're going to do is we're going to crowdsource Pedro Hernandez's bail. And within a day, they'd raised half the $250,000 to get this young man sprung from Rikers Island. Not only that, that effort caught the attention of the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Organization. It stepped in with its lawyers, got the bail slashed in half, paid the bail, and then shepherded this case through a wide variety of criminal proceedings until about a week and a half ago, a judge dropped all the charges against Pedro Hernandez. And the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Organization used his case as a test case, and now they're bailing out dozens and dozens and dozens of inmates in an overall effort to try and end cash bail as we know it. It all began with quality reporting on television, if I may say so. We got an Emmy nomination for it. But what really happened is when somebody engaged people in the story, there was much greater change. I believe we learned from that situation in a more recent story. Lisandro Jr Guzman was 15 years old when this past summer he was brutally stabbed by a group of young men who are allegedly members of the Trinitarios gang. Junior died as he was running to the hospital from the bodega where he was stabbed, trying to get help. He died on the street. A very sad story. This same trusted source, this private detective, came to me hours after it happened, and he said, you know what? You guys have covered the crime, but this is resonating with the community far beyond the crime itself. And that ended up being the lens through which we told this story. I started telling a number of stories day after day about Junior, about his family, about the community, about the outrage. And on a variety of platforms, people started talking back. They started naming names. They started sharing video of the scene, of the cars leaving, information that ended up leading to suspects. Look, whenever we do a crime story, we encourage people to call the Crime Stoppers hotline. Well, the NYPD had to bring on extra operators just to man the Crime Stoppers hotline because the reaction was that strong. And it continues now. My colleague, Mary Murphy, the lead investigative reporter at PIX11 News, did a series of 3 stories. She used her contacts, particularly in law enforcement, to do in-depth stories about the probe into the crime, to do a background about the victim and his family, to profile the suspects. And you know what happened? Every time she did a story, there was so much feedback from the various people who had a stake in this, which is a wide variety of people, not just in New York. Anyone who's a parent concerned about a kid who is innocent and in a case of mistaken identity gets killed, oh, it resonates. And every time she does a story, to my knowledge, that series has been extended to 12 now. Every time, the reaction is so strong that it leads to another story, more information, more input from people concerned. Which brings us back to BTS. In my review of their groundbreaking concert at Citi Field, I wrote that they're larger than life because somehow they manage to reach and access each of their hundreds of millions of fans who call themselves BTS Army. Well, this is something that local media can really learn from. I think we're learning this lesson, actually. You like TED Talks. If you didn't, you wouldn't be here. But the research does show that a sizable part of an audience interested in TED Talks is not necessarily getting their news from local news sources, local television news sources, to be more precise. But you know what also? You're smart people, you're active people, people who are experiencing a lot of things and often share them. And sometimes those things you might feel should be shared more broadly. You might feel are newsworthy. Tell those stories. That's very important. What I ask you to do, though, is when you see something, when you experience something, when you know something, when you have a conversation with someone that you want to share, and you feel perhaps it would benefit for a wider community to know about it, tag a trusted, established news source. We're paying attention. We're not just a news source. We're a news resource. What we are tasked to do is to find important material that's relevant to the community and make it well known. It's not just what we're tasked to do, though. It's something we like to do. So please do it. We live in a great democracy that right now, even at the highest levels of this great democracy, media is looked at as an enemy of the people. I say no. You hear a lot about citizen journalism. Well, we're all citizens, whether you're practicing journalism as a profession all the time or you're practicing some other profession, but you want to be informed. It's when we are all in this together, when we are all acting together to inform one another, that's when we make up the fourth estate, the most important part, I will argue, of the pillars of democracy, and make our democracy even stronger. Thank you.